Is your bearded dragon growing too fast? So before we begin this video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything that I put out in the future. And also, I'll put a link up in the corner for any videos that might interest you. So let's get rolling. So in today's video, I actually want to talk about bearded dragon growth rate. Now, this is a question that I get asked a lot. My bearded dragon is whatever age and it's only this big, or it is already this big. Should I be concerned? So it really just depends on a lot of things, but for the most part, every bearded dragon has a different growth rate, so you can't compare your bearded dragon to someone else's bearded dragon that's the same age. Obviously, there's things like illnesses and bad breeding that could cause your bearded dragon to be smaller than they're supposed to be, but for the most part, it's based off growth rate. So I've actually had bearded dragons that are the same age be completely different sizes, and again, because every bearded dragon has a different growth rate, it really just changes the overall perspective on how big should my bearded dragon be at this age. Now I'm going to show you some examples of bearded dragons that are the same age and bearded dragons that are different ages but the same size, so you can get an idea of where your bearded dragon is in terms of growth. But obviously this all depends on overall health and conditions of husbandry and a lot of other things that you should take into consideration when you are keeping your bearded dragon. So here we have two different bearded dragons. This guy over here, he is about 10 months old, and you can see he's already pretty big for a 10-month-old bearded dragon, versus this guy here is about a year and a half, and he's about the same size as this 10-month-old bearded dragon, maybe a little bit smaller. So this bearded dragon here ate well, lived good, had a good setup, and so did this guy. So the question that you should have is, this bearded dragon is younger, but he's the same size as this bearded dragon that's older. And again, growth rate is different for every bearded dragon, but you should never, again, compare your bearded dragon to someone else's bearded dragon. This guy and this guy being the same size in different ages is nothing to be concerned about. I'm not concerned that this guy is the same size as a 10-month-old bearded dragon, even though he is a year and a half old. I'm not concerned about that. That has nothing to do with the bearded dragon. The bearded dragon itself, he is actually growing just fine. These guys are almost full size, so you probably wouldn't even have to deal with them growing any longer. Usually bearded dragons will grow to full size around 18 months to 2 years. And then again, they continue growing after that because they're gaining weight. They're getting hefty. For the most part, the first 2 years is just getting longer and growing to that full size. And then after that, they'll just be putting on weight because that is what bearded dragons do. Bearded dragons will continue to put on weight for the rest of their lives, because that is how they maintain their weight during brumation and any other time when they stop eating. Bearded dragons have fat pads or fat storage locations, and these fat storage locations are where most of their heftiness comes from, I guess I should say. For example, usually their base of their tail right here will be a fat storage location. The top of their heads will have fat pads, and then you also see it in their shoulders, their neck, and obviously in the rest of their body as well. For the most part, if you ever notice your bearded dragon losing girth in their tail or having their fat pads sunk in, it's because they're losing weight, and that's when you should start being concerned about your bearded dragon not eating or any other issues that they might be facing. So again, these two bearded dragons, different ages, same size, no concern at all for this guy being a year and a half and the same size as a bearded dragon that's 10 months old. Again, it really just depends on the bearded dragon. Every bearded dragon has its own growth rate, so you shouldn't be concerned about your bearded dragon being smaller or the same size as a bearded dragon that's younger than they are. All right, so in this example, we're actually going to show two bearded dragons that are exactly the same age and they're different sizes. So this girl here and this girl here, they're actually clutch mates, so they were born in the same time frame, maybe within a couple days apart, but for the most part, they're the same age. You can see that this girl here is much smaller than this girl here, even though they are siblings. They are clutch mates. So the problem with people is they see this dragon and they see this dragon and immediately think that this girl here is unhealthy or isn't eating enough, when it could just be that she hasn't hit that growth spurt yet. This girl is about 180 grams, while this girl is about 110, 100 grams, on average 100 grams. But for the most part, I'm not concerned about this girl's growth rate, even though this girl is much bigger. So because they are clutch mates, I don't expect them to be exactly the same size. I do expect them to eventually get to the same size as their parents probably were. The mom, she's about 400 grams. So For these girls, I expect them to get to about 400 grams. The mom, she's still growing, so the mom is probably to 450 now. But when she did have these babies, she was about 400 grams. So I expect them to be around that size when they get older. But for the time being, I am not worried about their growth because they are both growing wonderfully. So obviously, don't be concerned about your bearded dragon's growth rate just because your bearded dragon's not growing the same speed as their siblings or their clutch mates. You are growing your bearded dragon the way you're growing it, and there might be somebody else growing that exact same bearded dragon that was a clutch mate a different way. They could be feeding it more, they could be feeding it less. It really just depends on the setup, how often they're eating, and on the individual bearded dragon. So here is another example. I don't know how many examples I got to show you for you to get this, but bearded dragons do grow differently regardless of age and regardless of how often they're eating. These girls here are actually different ages. She is about 1.5 years. She is about, I would say 9 months, 8 months. I have to look at their card, but 8 months, 9 months, 1.5 years. There's not really much of a size difference here. She is obviously a little more hefty than this girl here, but for the most part, they're around the same size, even though she is about twice the age as this girl. So bearded dragons all grow differently. This girl here grew wonderfully all the way up until she was about 9 months old. And then she kind of slowed down. She's still eating. She's still having sheds, but she's not getting this immense growth rate that everyone wants. She is not 400 grams at 1.5 years. She's probably around 340 grams at 1.5 years, which is fine. This girl, she's about 270 grams at 9 months. There is no problem with either of these girls' growth rates. They are both growing perfectly, and they're both eating wonderfully. I have never been concerned about either of these girls eating. I've never been concerned about either of these girls growing. They are actually tank mates. They live in the same enclosure. I've never had issues with that either. They're both the same temperament. They're both around the same size. Obviously, they weren't in the same enclosure as soon as I got them because obviously she was younger, so she was smaller, but eventually she caught up to this girl. So I was able to put them in the same enclosure because they are the same temperament. They have the same size, and this girl here is so docile. I knew she wouldn't do anything to this girl. So obviously, at the first few days, I watched them and I looked, make sure they weren't doing anything they were supposed to, because some females are pretty aggressive to other females. So I'll obviously make a video about cohabbing in the future because I'm sure people have questions. Not that you should do it. I'm not suggesting that you do it, but there's nothing wrong with doing it if you are experienced. Not everyone is experienced with cohabbing, so not everyone does cohabbing. But for the most part, for 12 years, I have been cohabbing about 9 of those years, and I have never had any issues with females fighting. Obviously, every once in a while, I'll get a female that's pretty aggressive to other females, and then she's in her tank by herself with no other dragons in there. But again, growth rate is depending on the dragon, 100%. Doesn't matter how much you feed them. Doesn't matter where they live. Doesn't matter how much basking they do. That's not really going to affect the growth rate at all. Now, something else that affects growth rate is the bugs that they're eating. Some bugs contain a lot more protein and a lot more fat than other bugs. So when you're feeding those bugs, you're obviously going to have a dragon that's growing a lot faster. For example, I feed my dragons dubia roaches, and dubia roaches have the highest protein content to fat ratio of any of the bugs that are out there. Second being black soldier fly larvae, or calci grubs, or calci worms, or whatever they call them now. But they're called black soldier fly larvae, and they also have a very good protein to fat ratio, but it's not as good of a ratio as dubia roaches. So because of how high the protein ratios are in these bugs, you have a chance of experiencing fatty liver issues, liver illnesses, and even gout. Yes, bearded dragons do get gout, so you got to be careful with all that. After my dragons get to a certain size, I slow down dramatically on bug feedings. My bearded dragons, once they get to about 350 grams, they're getting bugs 2 times a week, and I'm probably feeding 5 to 10 bugs a day for those 2 times a week. So every week they're getting about 20 bugs, adequate sized bugs. So I feed them greens every morning, and I give them an hour to figure out if they're going to eat the greens or not. And then I'll throw 5 to 10 bugs in there, depending on the bearded dragons. Some of my bearded dragons aren't going to need the 10 bugs. Some of them are only going to need the 5 bugs. And You got to be careful with baby bearded dragons. Baby bearded dragons and any juvenile bearded dragons do not know when to stop eating. So they will eat and eat and eat until they blow up. And that's what you got to be careful with. That's why you have to limit the number of bugs that they're eating. Usually with babies and younger bearded dragons, I will put a good number of bugs in there. And then after a certain time, like 15 minutes or so, I will take those bugs away. Whatever hasn't been eaten in 15 minutes, I'll take it away. The reason I say this, if you've ever seen somebody's bearded dragon get to 400 grams in 6 months, it is because they let their bearded dragon go crazy with bugs. Bearded dragons aren't supposed to be full grown at 6 months. That is outrageous. Do not let your bearded dragon get that big that quickly. Now, the question arises, is it wrong for my bearded dragon to get to 400 grams in 6 months if I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do, everything right? No, some bearded dragons just hit those growth rates really early, and there's nothing you can do about that. But you still should be careful with the protein intake and making sure that they don't have any issues or any illnesses in the future. I've noticed that bearded dragons that grow that quickly, that early in life, usually have a shorter lifespan. I've seen bearded dragons live up to 15 years, even longer than that. But I've also seen bearded dragons that are really big, really early in life, live like half of their life, live 7 years, 8 years, some even 10 years. But it's because they are not supposed to be growing that fast. Anytime a bearded dragons brumate, they lose a little bit of weight. I would say like 5 to 10% of their body weight sometimes is lost when they're brumating, depending on how long they brumate. And sometimes they don't lose any weight. Like I said, they have all that fat storage, and it really keeps them energized and healthy throughout the whole brumation. So with that said, if you are keeping your bearded dragon in the right setup, with the right heat, with the right food, you should never have any issues with their lifespan. But if they are growing that big that quickly, you should expect them to not live a full life. Just because they already did 6 months of their life as if it was 2 years. Because in 2 years, they were supposed to get to 400 grams, but instead they did it in 6 months. So you could already expect that a quarter of their life is probably going to be cut out. So that's just how it works. That's just how it's going to be. So if you've already let your bearded dragon get that big that quickly, there's really nothing you can do now. All you can do is monitor and make sure that you're taking them to the vet annually or even every 2 years. It really depends on what your availability is and how far your vet is, because not every location has a reptile vet. So just do what you're supposed to do. Make sure your bearded dragon is taken care of. Make sure you're not rushing their weight and their size early on in life. If they do it on their own, there's really nothing you can do. That is how their growth rates played out. Obviously, if you made it this far into the video, I appreciate it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything that I put out in the future.